Support for Trifles comes from the BSI Press. Manuscripts, collections of papers by international writers, and books covering a wide range of other Sherlockian topics. Find them online at BakerStreetIrregulars.com. And by listeners like you, who choose to support us on Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Patreon.com/Trifles.
Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the band was speckled and there were 6 Napoleons, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever stopped to wonder about why Dr. Watson was called James by his wife? Or of Sherlock Holmes's dining habits? Or what happened when he let a criminal escape?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 308, Revealing Costume. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we get into the nitty-gritty, itty-bitty details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm the teeny-weeny Burt Wolder.
And if you're wearing a teeny-weeny, itsy-bitsy, polka-dotted yellow... I don't know how that song goes anymore. Then you probably are revealing too much about yourself, Burt.
And that's exactly what our topic today is all about. It's about how the dress, how the clothes with which one decorates one's person can be revealing about your personality and so many other things.
Oh, boy. Well, I am very much looking forward to this. And if you have links that you want to check out, if we happen to mention any in this episode, or if you'd like to leave us a comment below the episode, you can do it on our show notes, which you can find at ihose.co/trifles308. All lowercase, ihose.co/trifles308. That'll take you to the SherlockHolmesPodcast.com website. Please visit there, poke around, subscribe by email so you don't miss an update, and check out our Patreon there as well. Our Patreon supporters get to listen to these episodes ad-free, plus they have other bonus material coming their way from time to time, and thank you gifts at certain tiers. So check that out, all in our show notes. We mentioned revealing costume here. We have talked about Sherlock Holmes in disguise before, and we've talked about some of the things that we might see in certain professions around the Victorian era. But in this case, we thought we'd turn our heads toward the descriptions of what people were wearing. And of course, we know that Sherlock Holmes used to make deductions from what is obvious, what is observable, and much of that came from their costume. So, Burt, why don't you take it away?
It's absolutely fundamental to Sherlock Holmes, and it's one of the reasons why Holmes as a character has been so attractive for so many years to so many people. Because when you observe what he does, when you read his narrations and his deductions from things he observes about how people are dressed, you invariably, almost unconsciously, say to yourself, you know, I could do that. If I paid more attention, if I just paid more attention and I looked to see, you know, who has buttoned the points of their collar and who hasn't, and who's got a scuff on their shoe, but I never do that. Maybe next time I need to do that. And a wonderful example, you know, and we have several today to talk about, but a wonderful example like that is in the Blue Carbuncle. It's sort of a classic because Watson comes back to Baker Street and he sees, of course, this battered felt hat that arrived with the goose. He says, I took the tattered object in my hands. I turned it over ruefully. It was a very ordinary black hat. of the usual shape. It was worn. The lining was discovered. There was no maker's name, but there were initials in it, scrawled on one side. It was pierced in the brim for a hat securer, but the elastic was missing, and it was cracked and dusty and spotted, I just didn't see anything. And he gives it back to Holmes. And Holmes says, well, this hat belonged to someone who was highly intellectual. He was fairly well-to-do. He's now fallen on evil days. He had foresight, but less now than previously, pointing to a moral retrogression, which when taken with the decline of his fortune seems to indicate some evil influence, probably drink, at work upon him. This may account also for the obvious fact his wife has ceased to love him. Well, Watson is just floored. But Holmes isn't done. He says he's a man who leads a sedentary life. He doesn't go out very often. He's out of training in time. He's middle-aged. He has grizzled hair. He's had a haircut in the last few days. He anoints his hair with lime cream. And by the way, it's extremely improbable he's had gas laid on in his house.
Ah, yes, something we touched on in a recent episode about candles, if you've been following along. Well, this is extraordinary. And you know what's even more remarkable about all of these? And Holmes, of course, says Watson is too timid in drawing his inferences. Watson can see all the same things that Holmes can see, but Holmes kind of connects the dots here and creates a personality profile. But the one thing that stuck out to me in Holmes making these remarks is he said, it is perhaps less suggestive than it might have been. And yet there are a few inferences which are very distinct. Now, I don't know how the hat could have been more suggestive with all of these different traits.
Well, yeah, and particularly when you go on and realize what else he deduces about the man's foresight and so on. And the lovely thing, one of the many lovely things about this example and this story, which is a great favorite of ours at this time of year, is that there's another example in the same story where the same thing happens. So when they're chasing down the geese, they wind up in Covent Garden Market, where a large stall bears the name of Breckenridge, and that's where they were looking. That's who they were looking for. And the proprietor, says Watson, a horsey-looking man with a sharp face and trim side whiskers, was helping a boy to put up the shutters. So they're all done for the day. They're closing up. And they have this little conversation about geese. And, the man is angered by Holmes' question about the source of the geese. And he says, I don't know who else has been bothering you with inquiries, but I'm always ready to back my opinion on a matter of fowls. I have a $5 on it that the bird I ate is country bred. And so they then, find out, he gets exactly the information that he wants. Mrs. Oakshott, 117 Brixton Road, egg and poultry supplier, 24 geese at 7 shillings, 6pence, and so on. But he says to Watson later, how did all that work so well? He says, well, when you see a man with whiskers of that cut and the pink 'un protruding out of his pocket, you can always draw him by a bet. If I'd put 100 pounds down in front of him, he wouldn't have given me such complete information. But he was drawn by the idea he was doing me on a wager.
I love that. And that's exactly what he does. He pulls him right out of. We saw this in the Sign of Four too, where he realized he would get more by playing up to someone's personality than he would if he asked them straight out, and they would just shut up like an oyster. He said, "Well, what would Mrs. Smith?" And then again here with Breckenridge. So, well, let's move on to our friend Charles Augustus Milverton. This is interesting because when Milverton presents himself at Baker Street, he's very careful about what he does. He had He was described as a man of 50 with a large intellectual head, a round, plump, hairless face, a perpetual frozen smile, and 2 keen gray eyes which gleamed brightly from behind broad, golden-rimmed glasses. And right there, even though the glasses are not necessarily clothing, they are part of the get-up, part of his accoutrement. And gold-rimmed glasses, they do say something about the way Milverton was trying to pass himself off. Watson goes on to say there's something of Mr. Pickwick's benevolence in his appearance, marred only by the insincerity of the fixed smile and the hard glitter of those restless, penetrating eyes. And his voice was as smooth and suave as his countenance, and he advanced with a plump little hand extended. So already we have this figure of the evil yet gentle-seeming Milverton. He's a man of seemingly of kind of a mixed type of appearance. You don't know exactly what to make of him. And I think this is in conjunction or in parallel with what he did and how he conducted himself with clients. And Holmes disregarded the outstretched hand, looked at him. Milverton's smile broadened. He shrugged his shoulders, removed his overcoat, and folded it with great deliberation over the back of a chair, and then took a seat. So I think that... And I should note that in the paragraph before we get that description of Milverton, he was described as a stout man in a shaggy astrakhan overcoat. So right there we have a sense, and he had a footman, he had his own carriage, right? So appearances, but the shaggy astrakhan, that was particularly interesting to me because astrakhan is basically a lamb's wool. And we see it displayed. I think the King of Bohemia had astrakhan trimmings on his overcoat, and Thaddeus Sholto had astrakhan trimmings on his dressing gown. So it's something that's ornate, something that is expensive. It comes from the Astrakhan region of Russia, so it would have been imported. Right? It's not something an everyday common criminal would have. And yet, Milverton's astrakhan was shaggy. So that tells us something about him as well. Keeping up appearances, as it were, and yet not doing so well if you look a little deeper.
Yeah, I like that. And I can't remember the particular conversation we had on Trifles about that, this other look at Milverton. Poor Milverton, who may have had to go to an Army-Navy store, for some of his supplies, and may have had to rent out space in his home, and had not the sort of weapon you thought he would have. Poor old rundown Milverton. But I don't know, Persian lamb, astrakhan. You could think that shaggy, was a characteristic of very expensive astrakhan or Persian lamb, but I have got no reason to think that was the case. But it's a great example of deduction about personality and character based on costume. And the interesting thing, too, is that nobody ever does this about Sherlock Holmes. No one ever looks at, of course, no one is as brilliant as Sherlock Holmes, but no one ever looks at Sherlock Holmes and says, I can tell by your appearance, Holmes, you haven't eaten in 3 days. You play the violin, I see. Oh, that chalk mark, where you put rosin on your bow is very, very suggestive. And I can still see the mark on your chin from holding it underneath there. And you have an elder brother, 7 years, I think, who... And Mycroft is another one. You would never deduce anything from his appearance that he was, had this great role in the British government.
Indeed. Well, let's see what we can make of this from our sponsor. If you're a regular listener of Trifles, you'll know that we also have another show called I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. And of course, we do hear of Sherlock everywhere around the globe, and it's partially due to the BSI Press.
The BSI Press has been doing the international series for well over a decade, and it takes you to places that, well, you couldn't otherwise go without the BSI Press's help, and that is inside scholarship coming from Sherlockian societies from all corners of the globe. You'll find Japan and Sherlock Holmes, Scandinavia and Sherlock Holmes, Australia, Italy, Spain, Canada. The list continues to grow. So if you're interested in what people from all around the world have to say about Sherlock Holmes, find that common bond at the BSI Press website, BakerStreetIrregulars.com, and pick out an international volume of your choice today.
All right, back to revealing costume. Who else do we find in costume that is revealed either intentionally or unintentionally?
Oh, well, there are so many examples. A very good one is the example of a member of society, someone in an esteemed position whom Holmes deduces is not as financially well off as he should be because of the soles of his boots.
And that is who example?
That
exactly.
Yeah, that's easy for you to say. That is that Lord St. Simon?
That's a good question.
You can tell that when I started that sentence, I had no idea who. I mean, I remember the scene. It's from the Naval Treaty, isn't it? Or is it from the Bruce Partington? It's either from the Bruce Partington plans or the Naval Treaty, I thought.
Well, you've got me on this one. I don't recall that example.
His boots were resold. You remember this. Where's my easy to find canon? Okay, you notice, of course, his boots have been resold. He's a fine fellow, said Holmes as we came out into Whitehall. But he has a struggle to keep up his position. He's far from rich, has many calls. You've noticed, of course, that his boots had been resold. And this, of course, is from I'm pretty sure, yes, there it is. It's the Naval Treaty.
The Naval Treaty, okay. Interesting. Well, that's an important aspect of what Holmes says. He says in The Creeping Man, he mentions the professor's knuckles, Professor Presbury. He said, did you observe his knuckles? I had to confess I did not, Watson says. Thick and horny in a way which is quite new in my experience. Always look at the hands first, Watson. Then cuffs, trouser knees, and boots. So Holmes had an order in which he looked at things, and he could take all this in within a matter of microseconds, I'm sure. Hands, cuffs, trouser knees, boots. We know the knees came into play in the Red-Headed League when he saw John Clay standing in the doorframe of the shop. He knew he had been working down below and had muddy knees. But boots, just as you said there, Bert, having them resold, it's a keeping up with the Joneses kind of observation.
Yeah. Now, interestingly enough, we should just close the loop here for our listeners. That was from the Naval Treaty, and we were talking about Lord Holdhurst, who was Percy Phelps' uncle. And this guy, is a cabinet minister, and Holmes says a future premier of England. And yet, he's getting his boots resold.
Well, I mean, if anyone were to learn of that, it should keep them in fairly high regard of him, because that means he would be taking great care with the nation's expenses.
Oh, I like that a lot. It's a campaign slogan.
Yeah. Oh, well, as similarly, we hear of the boots coming in, as well as other trimmings in the three Garridebs. Holmes, of course, said out loud to Mr. John Garrideb that he said, "Surely you've been in England some time." And Garrideb says, "Well, why do you say that, Mr. Holmes?" And he had this suspicious look in his eyes. And Holmes said, "Well, your whole outfit is English." And Mr. Garrideb forced out a laugh. He said, "I've read of your tricks, Mr. Holmes, but I never thought I'd be the subject of them. Where do you read that?" And Holmes says, the shoulder cut of your coat, the toes of your boots. Could anyone doubt it? So, yeah. And he said, however, your time is of value, and we did not meet to talk about the cut of my socks, which I loved. So there was an example in The Illustrious Client where Sir James Damery calls on Sherlock Holmes on behalf of his client, and he's trying to ensure that Violet de Merville does not get herself hitched to Baron Gruner. And he arrived punctually. Watson says it's hardly necessary to describe him, for many will remember that large, bluff, honest personality, that broad, clean-shaven face, and above all, that pleasant, mellow voice. Frankness shone from his gray Irish eyes, and good humor played round his mobile, smiling lips. His lucent top hat, his dark frock coat, indeed every detail, from the pearl pin and the black satin cravat to the lavender spats over the varnished shoes, spoke of the meticulous care in dress for which he was famous. I think that's just a lovely description. It's almost like a day at Ascot.
It is, but it's remarkable because Watson, this is the same man who, when presented, with Henry Baker's hat, really didn't see any significant details. But here, from the tips of his toes to his eyes, Watson has drunk in and sketched the entire man down to details like lavender spats and varnished shoes and the pearl pin in his cravat, not just any cravat, a black satin cravat. Watson clearly has spent some time over this description.
He has, and it's meant to show someone who was detail oriented, clearly. But at the same time, there's a detail later on that also says something to us, the reader, that I'm sure it said to Sherlock Holmes. He presents the problem. He says, here's the man who will literally stick at nothing. I should say there's no more dangerous man in Europe. And Holmes says, there's several opponents I've had who would qualify. And he says, don't you smoke? Then you'll excuse me if I light my pipe. So again, meticulous man does not smoke, but allows Holmes to smoke. And he said, if your man's more dangerous than the late Professor Moriarty or the living Colonel Sebastian Moran, then he is indeed worth meeting. He says, well, have you ever heard of Baron Gruner? And Holmes says, you mean the Austrian murderer? And here's where it gets interesting. Colonel Damery threw up his kid-gloved hands with a laugh. There's no getting past you, Mr. Holmes. Wonderful, wonderful. You've already sized him up as a murderer. The fact that he still had his gloves on in Baker Street, his kid-gloved hand. Now, kid gloves. This is again, lamb or goat kid, very, very soft, pliable leather. Usually unlined, these kid-gloved hands. And again, you're thinking, well, this is someone who's meticulous, didn't want to get his hands dirty, literally or figuratively. But he hadn't taken his gloves off upon greeting Holmes and Watson. That's odd.
Oh, it is odd, but it tells us two important things. First of all, Mrs. Hudson was not as meticulous when it came to cleaning the rooms in Baker Street, and Sir James immediately saw that he'd best keep his gloves on if he was actually going to be touching anything in the room. And the second thing it tells us is that among Sir James's hobbies was that he was a part-time pickpocket, and he was concerned about leaving fingerprints.
There you go.
Yeah, but that's just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
And the writing?
What else could be indicated? By the right cuff so very shiny for 5 inches.
And the left sleeve with the smooth patch near the elbow where you lean it on the desk.